We're on the heels of UFC 302, which went down from Newark, New Jersey in the Prudential Center. It was headlined by a UFC lightweight title bout between Dustin Poirier and Islam Makhachev, which was amazing. It was a great fight. But before we get into that, you guys know the drill. We're going to recap the entire card. First fight was Mitch Raposo versus Andre Lima. I said I wanted Mitch to win. I was rooting for Mitch, and he did everything in his power to try and force the issue, but Lima controlled the striking distance with the kicks, primarily leg kicks, which stifled Raposo. And he still had many shining moments with his hands, did Mitch. The commentary, upon hearing the decision, was shocked to hear a split, but when you really go back and watch the work that Mitch did with his hands, I don't think it's too ridiculous. And I really do think Mitch's future is bright in the UFC. I mean, Andre Lima missed weight in this fight and followed that up by going into that fight looking huge. So, this might be the last time that we see Andre Lima at 125. There's a chance. Next fight, Ailin Perez versus Joselynne Edwards. This was an odd fight, with the first round being more or less a sweep for sweep scramble fest on the ground. They were just going back and forth, reversing position. And then from there was a lot of stop and go, start and stop. There was a headbutt on the ground at one point that was done by Edwards, and I thought we were going to have a repeat of Estela Nunes and Pierre Rodriguez. Thankfully not. Perez fought on, but Perez also landed a spinning back fist on Joselynne Edwards and legitimately dropped her and hurt her, which was crazy. We got a big pop from the crowd. And then she also landed some really impressive judo throws, and she kind of had the bigger moments in the fight, which was what gave her this decision. Because Joselynne Edwards had control time, and it was probably a little bit more than Ailin Perez, but Ailin Perez had control time, and she did more with it. So, yeah, not too bad of a fight. Next fight, Bassil Hafez versus Mickey Gall. I mean, this was war. Like, this was a great fight. Mickey Gall went into this with seemingly improved vision in the pocket for striking, and I mean, his chin was off the chains. He took some crazy shots from Hafez and kind of walked through him and continued trying to find his shots, and he was finding his shots. He wobbled Hafez multiple times in this fight, but as the commentary team said, like, Bassil Hafez is an absolute tank at 170 pounds. And he went into that fight looking the exact same as he did in his UFC debut against JDM, despite having to eat some big shots from Gall. I mean, Gall had the will of 1,000 men in this fight, and it was awesome. I mean, the welterweights showed out on this card in terms of giving the fans something to cheer for, but Mickey took a lot of damage, and Hafez took some big shots too, but he was the more dominant, controlling half of this fight, which is what gave him the decision victory. I think I picked Bassil to win. We were off to a pretty good start on the picks in this fight. Honestly, picks in general for this card were all around pretty solid, but Phil Rowe versus Jake Matthews was not that case. I picked Phil Rowe to win, and it seemed like he had a bit of a rough weight cut because he seemed flatter on his feet and with his rhythm than normal. He also seemed a bit less explosive, and, like, don't get me wrong, early on in the fight, he was throwing those right hands from hell. He was throwing them with conviction, and he was exploding. But I'm used to seeing Phil Rowe bounce around a little bit, dart in and out, and work his rhythm and his distance and work in some kicks. And he just was sort of standing there waiting to counter Jake Matthews. And Matthews was forcing the issue and literally darting in and out, mixing it up to the head and the body, throwing combinations with both hands, and forcing a scrap out of Phil Rowe, despite having that reach disadvantage. And it was a good win for Jake Matthews. I'm picked against him, and I'm intrigued to see who the UFC matches him up with next. Next, we got Grant Dawson versus Joe Solecki. I mean, Dawson came out with a freaking flying knee on some Jorge Masvidal shit, and it nearly got him caught in a guillotine. But once he settled in on top, he was like a bull. He never gave up top position for a second in that fight. He got cut by a pretty well-timed elbow from the bottom by Solecki, but it didn't deter him whatsoever. He was throwing ground and pound, smothering Solecki against the cage, and staying busy so that it didn't warrant the referee standing them up and forcing Dawson to have to make effort to regain that position again. But it was a dominant decision win for Grant Dawson. Next, Jailton Almeida versus Alexander Romanov. I said in my last video, I literally said this is a toss-up, bounce-back win for Jailton by the UFC, and that's exactly what he got. First round submission. I literally drew like a thumbs up in my notes, because I ain't wasting any more time. What I said was going to happen, happened. So we move on. Kopylov versus Cesar Almeida. In the case of Cesar Almeida, it was sort of similar to Phil Rowe because he seemed like he may have had a rough weight cut also. He didn't appear as explosive and just like daunting as in his previous fights. And despite having moments against Kopylov, he was getting beat to the punch for a majority of the fight. And as the fight progressed, Kopylov was constantly shooting in on double legs and successfully landing them every single time. And every time Almeida worked his way back up, it would be Kopylov lands a combination, Almeida tries to return fire, and as he returns fire, he overextends and leaves himself open to the takedown, which Kopylov completed. Impressive and just workman-like performance by Roman Kopylov. Bounced back from the Anthony Hernandez loss. So I can't believe this fight was a split. I mean, you can't warrant the third round going to Almeida, and maybe the first, but the second had multiple successful takedowns from Kopylov as well. So I don't know what these judges were looking at in that fight. Next, we got Randy Brown versus Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos. This fight was so weird, man. There was so much going on in the first round. Like, you had the crowd chanting some political shit. You had Trump being chanted for. Like, the crowd was not locked in on this fight, and it kind of was. It just made the fight really hard to get into, because then there was eye pokes by Randy Brown, and it just was like a start and stop, and it was an annoying fight. Nonetheless, Randy Brown did the better work and, did more in neutral situations and moments where he may have had to work his way out of something. But Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos had to work through that reach disadvantage, and he tried his best. He was trying to chip away at Randy's legs to stop the movement, but Randy's reach and his jab, honestly, was just too much of a problem. There was a moment where they were on the ground and Dos Santos had control for a second. He had Randy's back, I believe, but like I said, Randy Brown worked his way out of that and regained a dominant position of his own. So, warranted decision victory. Another correct pick for your boy. Another incorrect pick on the next one. Niko Price versus Alex Morono. Another fight where it seemed like the weight cut impacted the performance. As the fight progressed, Alex Morono looked very, very just fatigued. He looked like he was fighting through fatigue significantly, but I do actually have an insider source, somebody who works very closely with Alex Morono. Shout out to you, Cody. He told me that the moment in the fight that really gassed Alex out was when he went for that omoplata and tried to transition it into a crucifix on Niko. And I believe that was like midway through the first, maybe early in the second. I can't remember, but I do remember that moment, and it makes sense because in order for you to try and maintain that position and just to get there, it expends a lot of energy and takes a lot of muscle endurance. And once you're back on your feet, bouncing around, trying to strike with somebody, it's tough. Literally, it is tough. But the thing about Niko Price was he never, ever, for a second, appeared deterred, and he kept forging through the fire. And as the fight progressed, he was walking Morono down. He was controlling the distance, controlling the pace, and landing the better strikes, which gave him the decision victory. And Niko Price is now 2-0 against Alex Morono. We move on. Kevin Holland versus Michal Oleksiejczuk. I'm pretty sure I said this is one of those fights where I see Kevin Holland getting a submission, and what happens? Technical submission. Oleksiejczuk didn't tap, but there was no way in hell, for one thing, that he was riding out the entire round in an armbar, and there was no way that he wasn't going to tap eventually in that case. Kevin Holland, in terms of body metrics and how long his limbs are, was not going to let Oleksiejczuk out of that. I get the whole let him fight through it, let him try and win with a injured arm. Like we've seen guys do it in the past, like with Hooker versus Jalen Turner and Brandon Moreno versus Davison Figueiredo, the first one. Good examples, but I just didn't see Oleksiejczuk really working his way out of that or doing anything after that. He was compromised. So I feel like it was the right call, but that's partially because I picked Kevin Holland by submission. I'm just gonna say that. Whatever. Co-main, another questionable decision. I rewatched the fight last night, and I mean, for you to not give at least 3 rounds to Sean Strickland is crazy to me, because Costa was just overwhelmed from the pressure of Strickland off the jump. Like, it was visible. He was backing up. There were moments where he tried to stand his ground and return shots, but the thing is, Sean didn't even have to really let his hands fly a majority of the fight. He was controlling the range with teeps by walking Costa down, forcing him back to a distance where Sean felt comfortable enough to throw the teep and land it. And that's how the fight progressed. And then as it went on and on, Sean got more comfortable letting his hands fly, and that's when the better of the exchanges belonged to Sean. So I just don't understand how a split is reality, seriously. But Strickland got the win. He's honestly a lot more in the title picture, in my opinion, right now than Israel Adesanya, which, how can you not say that when he's the last guy to beat Israel Adesanya, and he's lost the belt and since bounced back? So, good win for Strickland. I'd like to see Costa become the Costa of old, which is something that was mentioned by him and the commentators during the broadcast, and then after it was brought up by Costa. So I'm curious to see what form he shows up in his next one. And then the main event, the fight of the night, the UFC lightweight title bout between Dustin Poirier and Islam Makhachev. I had no notes written for my breakdown before the fight, and I'm so glad that was the case, because nothing that I could have wrote down would have prepared me for what I got to watch. And it was a great fight. Like, Dustin fought out of so many bad positions, had so many shining moments where he was landing shots on Islam, forcing Islam into uncomfortable situations, unfamiliar situations. But Islam is seriously a beast, bro. Like, he's insanely good. He stood in the pocket and got the better of the striking exchanges with Poirier. And then that takedown that he got late in the 5th to secure the position that led to that Darce choke took an inhuman amount of technique and strength pull off that late in the fight, especially when you're bleeding the way he was. That elbow that he got cut with was flush. I mean, that was an incredible fight. It was a bittersweet fight because we got to see the absolute best of Dustin. We got to see him work his way out of the spots that he was so, like, unfortunate to fall victim to in the past and not get out of. But, I mean, for Islam to find a Darce like that late is like legitimate pound for pound stuff. But Dana White said after the fight, he said, you know, John Jones is still active. So, I mean, I don't really know. I think that's kind of wild to say, but especially when Islam's putting on bangers against guys like Volkanovski and now Dustin Poirier and coming out on top. A lot of people thought that this fight was 2-2 going into the fifth. And I have to say, I feel like it was 3-1 Islam, but you could make a case for maybe the second and the fourth round for Poirier. Drop something. Regardless, bittersweet fight, like I said. Also, just wanted to say thank you to any and everyone who has shown the support on my last video, as well as pulling up to that live stream that I did. We had like over 500 people come and view it total, which I'm very appreciative of, even though I fell asleep. You know, we're going to keep trying. We're going to keep trying. Anyways, this was the UFC 302 Fight Talk recap. Stay tuned for UFC Louisville, and I will see y'all in the next one.